Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Julian laughed as he slid the divorce papers across the mahogany table toward Elena in front of the entire board. The sound of the heavy cardstock skidding across the polished wood was the only noise in the room, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning. He didn't just want her gone, he wanted her erased. He leaned back in the high-backed leather chair that had once belonged to her father, his thumb tracing the gold band on his finger, a ring he would likely replace by the end of the week. The air in the boardroom felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cedar and the sharp, metallic tang of Julian's sandalwood cologne. Elena looked down at the documents, then up at the man she had supported for over a decade. He looked every bit the successful CEO, his suit tailored to perfection, his hair swept back without a single strand out of place. But behind that mask, she saw the wounded wolf, a man so desperate to hide his failing investments that he was willing to cannibalize his own family. "Sign it, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with a practiced, casual cruelty. "You were always just a glorified house-sitter for the Vance estate anyway. It's time a real businessman took the reins." A few members of the board shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mr. Henderson looked at his shoes, while others simply stared at the water pitcher in the center of the table, watching the cold condensation bead and drip onto the linen runner. But Silas Thorne didn't look away. The developer sat to Julian's right, his eyes narrow and predatory, already mentally measuring the Vance orchards for a row of concrete luxury condos. "The board has already approved the merger with Thorne Industries," Silas added, his voice a gravelly rasp. "We need someone at the helm who understands growth, not someone who spends their days worrying about the heritage of a few dusty acres." Elena felt a sharp sting of outrage, a heat rising in her chest that she fought to keep from her face. She looked at Mrs. Gable, the longtime bookkeeper who sat at the far end of the table. The older woman's hands were trembling as she clutched her ledger, her eyes darting toward Elena with a look of profound apology. Julian had clearly spent the morning leaning on everyone Elena trusted. "And Maya?" Elena asked, her voice steady despite the roar in her ears. Julian waved a dismissive hand. "Maya Vance will have a trust fund that would make a princess jealous. She doesn't need to grow up in a drafty museum. We're selling the Manor house, Elena. Silas has a vision for the land that doesn't involve a 9-year-old's tire swing." That was the first rage spike. The thought of Julian selling the only home their daughter had ever known, the place where Elena's father had taught Maya to garden, felt like a physical blow. Julian was smiling now, a smug, entitled grin that suggested he'd already won. He picked up the heavy brass gavel that sat on the table, a ceremonial piece from the company's founding, and weighed it in his hand. "You have no standing here anymore," Julian said, leaning forward until she could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "You're a legacy hire in a world that's moved on. Sign the papers, take the settlement, and maybe you can afford a nice 2-bedroom condo in the city, somewhere far away from my business." Elena didn't reach for the pen. Instead, her fingers brushed the cold, hard edge of a small silver key tucked into her blazer pocket. It was the key to her father's private vault, the one Julian thought he'd emptied years ago. He had no idea that Mrs. Gable had moved the most sensitive ledgers the night before he took office. She looked at the gavel in his hand. It was a symbol of authority, one he was currently using to dismantle her life. "You're so sure of yourself, Julian," she said softly. The room went silent. Even Silas Thorne leaned back, sensing a shift in the air. "You think because you have the title, you have the power." "I have the signatures, Elena. That's all that matters in this room." He slammed the brass gavel down on the mahogany table. The crack was like a gunshot, echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "Meeting adjourned. Get her out of my sight." The second rage spike hit her then, but it didn't make her scream. It made her cold. She watched him stand, adjusting his cufflinks with the casual confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. He didn't even look at her as he began whispering to Silas about the demolition schedule. Elena stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She didn't sign the papers. She didn't cry. She simply picked up her handbag and walked toward the door. As she passed Mrs. Gable, she saw the bookkeeper give a microscopic nod. The trap was set. In the hallway, the silence of the boardroom was replaced by the muffled bustle of the office. Elena walked past the portraits of her ancestors, their painted eyes seeming to follow her. She reached the elevators and pressed the button, her hand perfectly still. As the doors slid open, she pulled out her phone and dialed a number she had memorized weeks ago. "It's me," she said, her voice like ice. "Julian just tried to gavel me out of my own company. He's selling the manor to Thorne." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. A grim smile touched her lips as she stepped into the elevator. "No, don't stop the sale yet," Elena said, watching her reflection in the polished chrome of the doors. "Let him think he's won. I want him to be at the very peak of his arrogance when the floor disappears. 2 days, right? Tell the lawyers to have the injunction ready for the groundbreaking ceremony." She hung up as the elevator began its descent. Julian thought he had just ended her. He had no idea he had just handed her the weapon she needed to destroy him. 2 days. The countdown had begun. The next morning, the silence of the manor was shattered by the abrasive sound of heavy boots on the parquet floor. Elena stood at the top of the stairs, her fingers grazing the cold mahogany railing. Below, in the grand foyer, the air was already thick with the cloying scent of Silas Thorne's expensive cigars. A smell that signaled rot long before it signaled wealth. Julian stood in the center of the room, his chest puffed out as he unrolled a set of architectural blueprints over the antique credenza. He didn't look up as she descended. He didn't need to. His arrogance was a physical presence, a wall of heat that filled the space. "Move that Ming vase, Silas," Julian said, his voice echoing with an entitled boom. "It's cluttered. We're going for a minimalist aesthetic once the demolition crew clears the east wing." Silas Thorne chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. He shoved the priceless porcelain aside with a careless thud. "It's a shame to lose the history, Julian, but progress requires a certain amount of carnage." Elena reached the bottom step, her expression a mask of glacial calm. "The East Wing houses the library, Julian. Our daughter's study is there." Julian finally turned, a smirk playing on his lips. He adjusted the cuff of his silk shirt, the gold of his watch catching the morning light like a predator's eye. "Maya can study in the car on the way to whatever apartment you manage to afford, Elena. This house is no longer a museum for your sentimentality. It's an asset, and as of yesterday, I've liquidated it." "You haven't liquidated anything until the ink is dry on the deed transfer," she replied, her voice steady. "The ink is dry enough for me," he snapped, stepping into her personal space. He leaned down, his breath smelling of bitter espresso and victory. "You're a guest here now, a squatter, really. I've already instructed the staff to stop taking your orders. Mrs. Gable is in the office right now, finalizing the severance for the groundskeepers. There's no room for charity in the new Vance budget." Elena's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a small, shadowed figure on the landing above. Maya was watching, her small hands gripping the balusters. The girl's eyes were wide, reflecting a maturity no 9-year-old should possess. "Daddy," Maya's voice was a fragile thread. "Where is my piano going to go?" Julian didn't even look up at his daughter. He began marking the blueprints with a thick red pen, the scratching sound like a knife on bone. "The piano is being auctioned, Maya. It's out of tune anyway. We're putting a state-of-the-art media suite where your playroom is. It'll be much better for business." The cruelty was so casual it made Elena's stomach turn. It was a rage spike, sharp and hot, but she channeled it into the secret weight of the phone in her pocket. "I need to speak with Mrs. Gable," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave. "Go ahead," Julian laughed, waving a dismissive hand. "Maybe she'll let you have a cardboard box for your things, but stay out of the study. Silas and I have a groundbreaking ceremony to plan for Friday. The press is already calling." Elena turned away, her heels clicking a rhythmic, defiant beat against the floor. She found Mrs. Gable in the small back office, the room smelling of old paper and peppermint. The bookkeeper looked up, her eyes red-rimmed behind thick spectacles. Without a word, Mrs. Gable slid a weathered ledger across the desk, her finger pointing to a series of offshore transfers Julian thought he had buried under 3 layers of shell companies. "He's been bleeding the estate dry for years, Elena," the older woman whispered. "He didn't just sell the manor to Thorne. He sold the mineral rights to the valley land, too. Land that was put in a protected trust for Maya when she was born." Elena touched the paper, the texture of the grain under her fingertips feeling like a weapon. "He broke the trust." "He forged the signature," Mrs. Gable said, her voice trembling. "He thinks he's the only one who knows the password to the digital vault." A slow, predatory smile touched Elena's lips. Julian was at the peak of his mountain, looking down at everyone he had stepped on to get there. He was so busy measuring the foyer for his new ego that he hadn't noticed the foundations were already turning to dust. 2 days, Elena murmured, more to herself than the bookkeeper. "He wants a groundbreaking ceremony on Friday. Let him have it. I want the whole city to see exactly what he's built his empire on." She walked back toward the foyer, passing Julian as he bragged to Silas about the height of the new glass tower. He didn't even glance at her. He was too intoxicated by his own reflection in the polished marble. Elena didn't stop. She had one more call to make and a very specific set of documents to print. The countdown wasn't just for the house. It was for the man who thought he could burn a legacy and not get caught in the smoke. 2 days later, the morning air in the valley carried a sharp, damp chill that smelled of wet slate and dormant earth. Elena Vance sat in the furthest booth of a roadside diner, the vinyl seat cracking beneath her. She watched the door until Mrs. Gable scurried in, clutching a tattered leather briefcase against her chest like a shield. The older woman's hands shook as she slid into the booth, the bitter scent of oversteeped Earl Grey rising from the mug between them. Mrs. Gable didn't speak at first. She simply reached into the briefcase and pulled out a heavy, cream-colored envelope. The paper was thick, topped with a wax seal that had long since crumbled into crimson dust. Elena felt a jolt of adrenaline as she touched the document. This was it, the original cider press contract. It was the foundational agreement Julian believed had been incinerated in the accidental office fire 3 years ago. "He thinks he's scrubbed the record clean, Elena," the bookkeeper whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator unit. "He's already leveraged the estate's western ridge against Silas Thorne's investment. But that land, it's protected by a bloodline covenant. He can't sell a single acre without the signature of the eldest living heir. And he isn't the eldest." Elena ran her thumb over the sharp, metallic tang of the old brass seal still embedded in the paper. She was the eldest, by 3 minutes. Julian had spent a lifetime pretending those 3 minutes didn't exist, gaslighting her into believing their father had amended the will on his deathbed. "This is undeniable," Elena said, her voice steadying. "He built a glass empire on a foundation of forged signatures." "He's at the club right now," Mrs. Gable warned, her eyes darting to the window. "Celebrating the permit approval with Silas. They're calling it the Vance Legacy Project. It makes me sick." Elena thanked her and watched the woman leave before heading toward the valley's most exclusive country club. She didn't go to hide. She went to see the enemy at his peak. The club smelled of expensive cedarwood and the cloying, citrusy cologne Julian favored. She found him on the terrace, holding court at a table draped in white linen. Silas Thorne sat opposite him, leaning back with the casual, predatory grace of a man who had never lost a bet. Between them sat a bottle of vintage scotch that likely cost more than Elena's monthly mortgage. Julian looked up as she approached, his expression shifting from triumph to a bored, practiced contempt. He didn't stand. He didn't even offer a chair. "Still wearing that same coat, Elena?" Julian asked, his voice carrying easily to the neighboring tables. A few members looked over, their eyes tracking the contrast between his tailored Italian suit and her sensible, worn wool. "I suppose it's fitting. It matches the state of the house. You look like a relic of a past that's about to be demolished." Silas chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "The permits are finalized, Julian. We shouldn't be cruel to the displaced." "I'm not being cruel," Julian said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of his drink. I'm being realistic. I've already looked into a few state-funded housing options for you, and for Maya Vance, of course, I assume you'll want her in a public school now. Private tuition is a bit steep for someone with zero assets. The rage spiked in Elena's chest, hot and focused. Mentioning her daughter's future like it was a line item he could strike through was his final mistake. She felt the weight of the contract in her bag, a secret power that made his insults feel like the desperate barks of a cornered animal. "You seem very confident for a man standing on shifting sand, Julian," she said, her voice dropping to a cool, lethal calm. Julian laughed, the sound loud and entitled. "Sand, I'm standing on 20 stories of steel and glass. The groundbreaking ceremony is in 48 hours. The governor is coming, the press is coming, and you'll be packing your boxes." He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Do you know what you are, Elena? You're a footnote, a shadow in the corner of my success. By Friday evening, no one will even remember you lived in that house." Elena didn't flinch. She leaned in, close enough to smell the peat on his breath. "I wouldn't be so sure. Heritage has a funny way of surfacing when you least expect it. I'll see you at the ceremony." "You aren't invited," Julian snapped. "Oh, I think I have a front row seat," she replied. She turned and walked away, the rhythmic, heavy thud of a piled driver in the distance sounding like a countdown. Back in her car, Elena pulled out her phone. She didn't call a friend, she called a specific investigative journalist she'd been vetting for weeks. "It's Elena Vance," she said, her gaze fixed on the digital clock on her dashboard. "I have the original cider press contract, and I have the forensic audit of Julian's offshore accounts. Are you ready for Friday?" The voice on the other end was eager. "We're ready. If this is what you say it is, he won't just lose the project. He'll lose everything." Elena hung up and gripped the steering wheel. 48 hours. Julian was busy measuring the height of his tower, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet had already been claimed. She looked at the heavy envelope on the passenger seat. The countdown wasn't just for the house anymore. It was for the man who thought he could erase her existence and call it progress. Friday wasn't a groundbreaking. It was a funeral for a lie. The day before the groundbreaking ceremony, the Vance estate felt less like a home and more like a carcass being picked clean by vultures. Yellow caution tape fluttered in the autumn breeze, cordoning off the centuries-old oak grove where Julian had already authorized the first round of clearing. The air was thick with the sharp, metallic scent of diesel exhaust and the gritty taste of churned earth as heavy machinery rumbled into position. Elena stood on the porch, her fingers grazing the smooth, cold leather of the portfolio tucked under her arm. She watched as a sleek black sedan pulled up the gravel drive, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled on her modest coat. Julian stepped out, followed closely by Sela's Thorn. They looked like two sides of the same counterfeit coin. Julian in his tailored Italian wool, Sela's in a suit that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, both radiating the oily confidence of men who believed the world was theirs for the taking. "Still here, Elena," Julian called out, his voice carrying over the rhythmic thud-thud of a piled driver in the distance. He didn't look at her. His eyes were fixed on the blueprint Sela's was unrolling across the hood of the car. "I told you to have the east wing cleared by noon. The catering crew needs the space for the VIP tent." "The east wing is part of the original deed, Julian," she replied, her voice steady and deceptively soft. She stepped down the stairs, her heels clicking sharply against the stone, a sound of precision in a landscape of chaos. "It's protected by the historical easement. You might want to reread the cider press contract before you let those excavators move another inch." Julian finally looked up, a smirk dancing on his lips. It was the look of a man humoring a child. "The easement is a technicality, and technicalities can be bought, buried, or bypassed. Sela's has already handled the zoning board. Tomorrow isn't just a groundbreaking, it's a coronation. You're clinging to a ghost story while I'm building an empire." Sela's chuckled, the sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. He adjusted his gold cufflinks, the metal catching the harsh afternoon sun. "It's about progress, Mrs. Vance. Sentiment doesn't pay dividends. You'd be wise to stop playing the martyr and start packing. We wouldn't want the noise of the demolition to disturb your transition. The arrogance in his tone was a physical weight, a rage-inducing pressure that made Elena's pulse quicken. She saw Mrs. Gable standing near the equipment trailer, a stack of ledgers clutched to her chest. The bookkeeper's eyes were wide, darting between the men and Elena. She knew the truth of the offshore accounts. She knew the house was built on a foundation of debt and deceit. Seeing Elena stand her ground without a hint of the usual desperation made the older woman pause, her brow furrowed in confusion. "I'm not playing a martyr, Silas," Elena said, stepping closer until she was within the circle of their expensive cologne, a cloying mix of sandalwood and ambition. "I'm offering a courtesy, a warning, if you will. Foundations are tricky things. If you build on a lie, the whole structure tends to come down the moment the wind shifts." Julian laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "The wind isn't shifting, Elena. I own the wind. Now get out of the way. We have a legacy to finalize." He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence with a casual wave of his hand as he pointed toward the old press house. "That comes down first thing tomorrow. I want the rubble cleared before the governor arrives." Elena didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply touched the edge of the forensic audit inside her portfolio, the paper crisp and lethal. "I'll be sure to be front and center for the first shovel, Julian. I wouldn't miss the look on your face for anything in the world." As she walked away, she felt Silas's gaze lingering on her back, the first flicker of uncertainty crossing his predatory features. He noticed the way she didn't flinch at the roar of the engines. He noticed the predatory stillness in her posture. Inside the house, Maya was waiting by the window, her small face pale against the glass. She watched her father and Silas laughing outside, unaware that the ground beneath them had already been hollowed out. Elena placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder. "Is it tomorrow, Mom?" Maya whispered. "Tomorrow," Elena confirmed, her gaze fixed on the digital clock on the mantel. 24 hours. The countdown was no longer about saving the house. It was about the moment the wolf realized the sheep had been the one guarding the gate all along. Elena went to her desk and opened the final file. The trap was set, the witnesses were invited, and the arrogance of the Vance men had provided the perfect bait. Tomorrow, the groundbreaking wouldn't be for a tower. It would be for a grave. The evening of the groundbreaking gala arrived with a predatory chill that the outdoor heaters on the Vance estate couldn't quite mask. Under a canopy of silk tents and strings of amber lights, the air smelled of expensive lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of chilled champagne. It was a scene of calculated opulence, designed by Julian to project a stability he no longer possessed. He moved through the crowd like a king already crowned, his laughter booming a bit too loudly, his hand perpetually gripping a crystal tumbler of scotch. Elena stood near the edge of the stone terrace, her fingers grazing the cold silk of her deep emerald gown. She didn't look like the woman who had spent the last decade shrinking into the shadows of this house. Her posture was a blade, honed and upright. Beside her, Maya stood in a matching velvet dress, her small hand tucked firmly into Elena's. The girl's eyes were wide, tracking her father as he held court near the center of the lawn. "He looks happy, Mom," Maya whispered, her voice barely audible over the soft swell of the string quartet. "He looks certain," Elena corrected gently. "There's a difference." Julian noticed them then. He detached himself from a group of local councilmen and sauntered over, his face flushed with the heat of his third drink. Silas Thorne followed a few paces behind, looking like a vulture in a bespoke tuxedo. Silas's gaze didn't linger on the decorations. He was looking at the house, already mentally stripping the copper from the walls. "There she is," Julian said, his voice carrying just enough to draw the attention of the nearby guests. He didn't look at Elena's face. He looked at her jewelry, checking to see if she'd worn the family diamonds he demanded she put on. "The woman of the house. You're late to your own party, Elena. I had to apologize to the mayor's wife twice because you weren't at the door." He reached out, not to touch her hand, but to adjust the strap of her dress with a proprietary tug that was meant to look affectionate but felt like a leash. "The preparations took longer than expected," she replied, her voice a cool stream of water against his fire. "I wanted to ensure everything was in place for the announcement." Julian chuckled, turning to Silas. "Hear that? She's finally getting into the spirit of progress. It only took 10 years of dragging her feet." He turned back to Elena, his eyes narrowing. "Go find Mrs. Gable. She's hovering near the buffet looking like she's seen a ghost. Tell her to sharpen up. This is a celebration, not a wake." Elena felt the familiar heat of a rage spike in her chest, but she didn't let it reach her eyes. She watched him walk away, his hand landing heavily on Silas's shoulder. They were two men built on the assumption that the world was theirs to carve up. Julian didn't even realize he was standing on a trapdoor. She moved through the crowd, the sound of high heels on the bluestone echoing like a countdown. Every few steps, a guest would stop her, offering hollow congratulations on the exciting new chapter for the Vance legacy. Elena smiled, a practiced porcelain expression that revealed nothing. She found Mrs. Gable near the shadows of the tall hedges. The older woman was clutching a leather-bound ledger to her chest as if it were a shield. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. "The servers are in place," Mrs. Gable whispered as Elena approached. "The media links are live. Julian thinks the screens are just for the architectural rendering." Elena leaned in, the scent of Mrs. Gable's lavender perfume a brief comfort in the suffocating atmosphere. "And the external accounts?" "Transferred," the bookkeeper said, her voice trembling slightly. "Silas Thorne's signature is on every single one of the diverted labor contracts." Julian signed the authorizations this afternoon, thinking they were the final permits for the tower. Elena reached out and squeezed the woman's hand. The skin was parchment dry. "You've done a brave thing, Martha. After tonight, you won't ever have to look at his books again." "I just want it to be over," Mrs. Gable said, looking toward the stage Julian had erected near the old oak tree, the tree he planned to fell as the symbolic start of the construction. "It's already over," Elena said. "He just hasn't heard the sound of the crash yet." She left the bookkeeper and headed toward the bar, where Silas Thorne was currently lecturing a junior architect on the necessity of ruthlessness in urban design. As she passed, Silas stepped into her path, blocking her way with a smirk that didn't reach his predatory eyes. "You're looking remarkably composed tonight, Elena," Silas said, his voice a low, oily drawl. "Most women in your position would be mourning the loss of their garden. But then again, you always were smarter than Julian gave you credit for. You know when a ship is sinking." "I do," Elena said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I've become quite an expert on the signs of structural failure." Silas chuckled, leaning closer. The smell of expensive tobacco clung to him. "Julian thinks he's the one holding the shovel tomorrow, but between you and me, I'm the one who owns the dirt. Once the foundation is poured, this name, Vance, won't be anything more than a footnote on a plaque in the lobby." "Is that what you think?" Elena asked, her voice tilting with a dangerous curiosity. "I know it," Silas replied, tapping the side of his nose. "Arrogance is a hell of a blindfold, and your husband has been wearing one for years. He signed away more than he realizes." "He certainly has," Elena agreed. She felt the weight of the flash drive in her clutch, a small, silver sliver of digital truth that contained every kickback, every forged signature, and every cent Julian had stolen from Maya's trust to fund Silas's offshore holdings. The lights across the lawn flickered twice, the signal. Julian was stepping onto the stage now, tapping the microphone. The feedback hummed through the speakers, a sharp, jarring sound that cut through the polite chatter of the elite. The crowd began to drift toward the stage, a sea of silk and wool converging on the man who thought he was their master. Elena took her place at the very front, Maya standing just behind her. She watched Julian puff out his chest, the moonlight catching the sweat on his forehead. He looked out over the audience, his eyes landing on Elena with a look of smug triumph. He raised his glass, the amber liquid shimmering. "Friends, family, partners," Julian began, his voice booming through the speakers. "They say you can't build the future without burying the past. Tonight we say goodbye to the old Vance estate, and tomorrow we rise." Elena reached into her bag, her fingers closing around the cold metal of her phone. She didn't look at the stage. She looked at the giant LED screen behind Julian, which currently displayed a static image of the Vance Tower. "But before we begin," Julian said, his grin widening as he looked at Sila's, "I have a special presentation. A look at the legacy we're truly building." He gestured to the technician in the booth, a man Elena had paid double his monthly salary to change the file path 10 minutes ago. "Wait for it," Elena whispered to herself, the words tasting like the first breath of air after a long dive. Julian turned toward the screen, his hand raised in a grand theatrical gesture, his mouth open to deliver the next line of his rehearsed speech. The crowd leaned in, their faces illuminated by the glow of the rising digital display. The screen flickered. The image of the tower vanished. In its place, a spreadsheet appeared, followed by a scanned document with Julian's signature highlighted in bright, neon red. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was a vacuum. Julian's arm stayed frozen in the air, his smile beginning to twitch as the first line of the bank statement scrolled upward for the entire city to see. The silence in the ballroom was a physical weight, heavier than the crystal chandeliers hanging overhead. The hum of the projector was the only sound, a low, mechanical drone that smelled of scorched dust and ozone. On the massive screen, the second ledger, the real one, scrolled upward with agonizing slowness. It wasn't just numbers. It was a map of every bribe, every offshore transfer, and every cent Julian Vance had siphoned from the family estate to cover his failing ventures with Sila's thorn. Julian Vance's face underwent a grotesque transformation. The practiced, charismatic mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. His skin, usually a healthy, sun-kissed bronze maintained by expensive vacations, turned a sickly, translucent gray, like curdled milk. The corner of his left eye began to twitch rhythmically, a frantic, uncontrollable pulse that betrayed his panic. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling just enough to reveal the dry, white foam of a man who had suddenly forgotten how to swallow. The arrogance that usually defined his posture vanished, replaced by a hollow, sunken-chested slump that made his designer tuxedo look 3 sizes too large. He looked less like a titan of industry and more like a ghost caught in the headlights. A sharp clink echoed through the hall as a board member dropped her champagne flute. The glass shattered on the marble, the sound like a gunshot in the vacuum of the room. Sila's thorn, standing near the stage, didn't move to help his partner. Instead, his predatory eyes narrowed, his gaze shifting from the screen to the exit. He was already calculating the distance to the door, his loyalty evaporating the moment the prophet did. Near the back, Mrs. Gable clutched her handbag to her chest. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, her chin trembling not with fear, but with the sheer, overwhelming relief of a secret finally shared. She looked at the screen and then at the stage, her nod of validation sharp enough to cut the air. The socialites in the front row, the same people who had laughed at Julian's jokes only minutes ago, began to recoil. It was a subtle collective movement, a shifting of chairs, a leaning away as if his failure were a contagious disease. Whispers began to bubble up, a hissing tide of "is that his signature?" And I knew the numbers didn't add up. "Julian," Elena Vance said, her voice cutting through the rising murmurs. She didn't shout. She didn't have to. The microphone at the podium was still live, and her words carried with the cold, sharp clarity of a winter morning. She stepped out from the shadows of the wings, her heels clicking against the wooden stage with the rhythm of a ticking clock. He turned toward her, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. "Elena, it's a fabrication. A glitch. Sila's, tell them." "Sila's is already checking his watch, Julian," she interrupted, her eyes never leaving his. She stopped 3 feet away, the light from the projector casting the red-highlighted fraud across her own face like war paint. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, leather-bound book, the physical original of the digital ghost behind them. She held it up, not for him, but for the cameras at the back of the room. "You spent so much time building a pedestal, Julian. You forgot it was made of my father's bones. You told me I was just a ghost in this house. You told me I didn't belong in your world." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper that the microphone still caught and amplified for every witness in the room. "You were right. I don't belong in your world. Because starting tomorrow, your world belongs to me. Consider this your eviction notice." She didn't wait for his rebuttal. She didn't stay to watch him scramble or offer the pathetic, hollow excuses she knew were coming. Elena turned on her heel, the fabric of her dress snapping like a whip. She walked off the stage and through the center aisle of the ballroom, the crowd parting before her like the Red Sea. She could feel Julian's eyes on her back, could hear the sudden, frantic roar of the crowd as the board members surged toward the stage, but she didn't look back. She pushed through the heavy oak doors and into the cool night air, the scent of expensive lilies and betrayal finally fading behind her. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, her phone buzzed in her hand. A single message from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "The bank accounts are frozen. He has nowhere left to run." Elena looked up at the moon, a thin smile finally touching her lips. The hunt was over, but the reckoning had only just begun. The night air was sharp, cutting through the silk of Elena's dress as she reached the bottom of the grand staircase. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom groaned open again, the sound of the gala's frantic murmurs spilling out into the quiet evening. Julian's footsteps were uneven on the stone, the frantic pace of a man who had finally realized the floor was no longer beneath him. "Elena!" he hissed, his voice cracking with a desperation he couldn't hide. He caught up to her at the edge of the circular driveway, his hand reaching for her arm before she stepped back, creating a cold, impenetrable wall of space between them. "What have you done? The accounts, I just got a notification. Everything is flagged. You can't do this. That money is the company's lifeblood." She looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the hollow space where a husband should have been. The scent of expensive lilies from the ballroom still clung to his tuxedo, but it was overpowered by the sharp, acidic smell of cold sweat and panic. "It isn't the company's money, Julian," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that made his frantic shouting seem small. "It was my father's. Then it was Maya's. You were just the temporary steward who forgot he didn't own the land he stood on." A black sedan pulled up to the curb, the headlights cutting through the darkness to illuminate the wreckage of Julian's composure. Silas Thorne stepped out, his expression as unreadable as a ledger. Julian's face lit up with a desperate, pathetic hope. He scrambled toward the developer, his hands shaking as he smoothed his disheveled jacket. "Silas, thank God. There's been a mistake. My wife, she's had some kind of breakdown. She's frozen the Vance accounts. We need to move the offshore funds now before the board gets a formal injunction. You have the leverage, Silas. Tell them this is part of our merger." Silas Thorne didn't even look at him. He walked past Julian as if he were a piece of discarded gala decor and stopped in front of Elena. He handed her a slim, leather-bound folder, his nod respectful, almost deferential. "The audit is complete, Mrs. Vance," Silas said. "The discrepancies Julian attempted to hide in the Thorne-Vance merger are all documented. My legal team has already severed the partnership. We don't do business with liabilities." Julian froze. The color drained from his face in a way that was almost skeletal, leaving his skin looking like gray parchment under the streetlights. His eyes, usually so sharp and predatory, went dull and wide, flickering between Elena and Silas like a trapped animal looking for a hole in a fence that had already been electrified. His mouth hung open, his lower lip trembling almost imperceptibly as the reality of his total isolation settled into his bones. The arrogant tilt of his chin, the one he had used to look down on Elena for a decade, collapsed into a hollow, sunken stare. He looked suddenly older, smaller, as if the expensive Italian wool of his suit was the only thing holding his frame together. "Silas," Julian whispered, the word barely a breath. "We had a deal. I gave you everything." "You gave me a house of cards, Julian," Silas replied, his voice devoid of empathy. He turned back to the car. "Good evening, Elena. My office will contact you regarding the restoration of the family holdings." As the sedan pulled away, the silence of the night felt heavy, punctuated only by the distant, rhythmic screech of a security gate closing. From the shadows near the valet stand, a small figure emerged. Mrs. Gable walked forward, her sensible heels clicking softly on the pavement. She held a digital drive in her hand, her face set in a mask of grim, professional satisfaction. "I've sent the final encryption keys to the forensic accountants, Elena," the older woman said, ignoring Julian entirely. "Every cent he diverted to his personal shell companies has been tracked. There's nowhere left for the money to hide." Julian turned on the bookkeeper, his face twisting into a mask of pure, impotent rage. You've been with this family for 30 years. I trusted you." "You trusted my silence, Julian," Mrs. Gable corrected him, her voice like flint. "But I didn't work for you. I worked for the Vances, and you haven't been a Vance in a very long time." A group of board members exited the building, their voices hushed as they spotted the trio. They didn't come closer. They stood in a semicircle of judgment, watching the man who had led them for years crumble in the fluorescent glow of the driveway. One of them, a woman Julian had once mocked for her sentimental investment style, shook her head and turned away, pulling her wrap tighter around her shoulders as if to distance herself from the contagion of his failure. Julian looked around, his breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. He looked at the ballroom he'd just been evicted from, at the allies who were now strangers, and finally at Elena. "You're leaving me with nothing," he snarled, though the threat lacked any teeth. "I'll fight this. I'll take Maya Vance. I'll make sure you never see her." "Maya is already with my lawyers, Julian," Elena interrupted, her voice as sharp as a guillotine. "She saw the truth a long time ago. She's the one who found the files you thought were deleted from the home server. Even a child could see the rot in you." She reached into her small clutch and pulled out a single, folded piece of paper. She didn't hand it to him. She let it flutter to the damp pavement at his feet. "That's the address of the apartment I've rented for you. It's small, it's far from the city, and the rent is paid for exactly 1 month. After that, you're on your own. Don't bother coming back to the house. The locks were changed 10 minutes ago." Elena turned toward her own car, which had just pulled into the circle. She didn't look back to see him drop to his knees to retrieve the paper. She didn't stay to hear his final, desperate pleas. As the door closed behind her, the only sound she heard was the quiet, rhythmic purr of a life finally reclaimed. 6 months had passed since the night the locks were changed, and the Vance name was reclaimed. The heavy oak doors of the estate stood open to the spring breeze, allowing the scent of blooming jasmine and fresh beeswax to circulate through the foyer. Elena Vance sat at the mahogany desk in the library, the same desk where she had once watched her husband sign away their future. Now the surface was covered in spreadsheets that told a different story, one of recovery, growth, and a legacy finally scrubbed clean of corruption. Mrs. Gable entered the room, the soft click of her sensible heels on the polished floor a rhythmic comfort. She placed a steaming cup of Earl Grey on a coaster, her eyes crinkling with a quiet, hard-won satisfaction. "The final audit of the Thorne development is complete," she said, her voice steady. "The investigators found exactly what we suspected. Silas Thorne wasn't just Julian's partner, he was the architect of the shell companies. He's currently facing 3 counts of racketeering. I doubt he'll be seeing the sun from outside a courtyard for a long time." Elena leaned back, the leather of the chair sighing beneath her. She felt a strange lack of triumph, replaced instead by a profound, cooling peace. "And the restitution. The court-ordered freeze on his assets covered the missing funds from your father's trust," Mrs. Gable replied. "The estate is solvent, Elena. For the first time in a decade, you don't owe a debt to a ghost." While the sun bathed the library in gold, 15 miles away, Julian lived in a world of gray. He sat on the edge of a sagging mattress in the apartment Elena had rented for him, the one he had been forced to take over the lease for after that first month expired. The air in the room was thick with the smell of stale coffee and the metallic hiss of a radiator that never quite got the job done. He stared at his hands. They were no longer the manicured hands of a high-stakes developer. They were calloused and stained with the grime of the warehouse, where he now spent 10 hours a day moving crates. He had tried to call his old contacts, his brothers in the industry, but the silence had been absolute. Sela's thorn had vanished into the legal system, and the rest of the circle had treated Julian like a contagion. He reached for a crumpled newspaper on the floor, his eyes falling on a business feature. There was Elena, looking radiant and composed, standing in front of the Vance Foundation's new community center. She looked like a woman who had never known a day of fear. Julian felt a surge of the old entitlement, a flare of rage that she was thriving while he was counting pennies for a bus pass, but it flickered and died. He was too tired for rage. The cost of his arrogance was written in the stained wallpaper, and the silence of a phone that never rang. Back at the estate, the sound of laughter drifted in through the open window. Elena stood and walked to the glass, watching Maya run across the manicured lawn. The girl was chasing a golden retriever, her hair flying behind her like a banner of pure, uncomplicated joy. Maya had stopped asking when her father was coming home weeks ago. She had adapted with the terrifying efficiency of the young, accepting the new quiet of the house as if the chaos of the past had been nothing more than a bad dream. Elena watched her daughter, and the familiar ache tightened in her chest. This was the cost of her victory. She had saved the house, the name, and their future, but she had been forced to amputate a piece of her daughter's world to do it. She had traded a father for a fortress. Maya paused, looking up at the window, and waved. Elena waved back, a small, tight smile on her lips. She had become the protector she needed to be, the lioness who had finally stopped sleeping, but she knew she would never again be the woman who believed in the simple safety of a marriage vow. She turned away from the window as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the lawn. The house was hers. The name was hers. But as she walked through the silent, cavernous halls toward her daughter, she realized that while she had won the war, the scars were the only things that would never truly belong to the past. She had reclaimed her life, but the price of justice was a throne built on the ruins of the family she had once dreamed of. Elena Vance walked into the light of the hallway, the sound of her own footsteps the only thing filling the magnificent, lonely space.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.